We should get going. Got it. All right. Thanks, Diane. And just so everybody knows where they are, you were at Greening USA's Green Bag Lunch for December. Thanks for joining us. Our board president, Diane Brandley, is running the controls of the Zoom and would like to make a few remarks before I introduce the program and our panelists for you today.
Thanks, John. Welcome, everyone. It's really exciting to see new faces and new names in the list. Greening USA is a nonprofit, New York State nonprofit, based in Central New York. We got our 501c3 back in 2004, and John and I were both there when that happened, so we've been around a while. Our mission is to advocate for sustainable communities to the benefit of local economies and environments. So my shameless self-promotion is to say that none of us gets a penny for what we do. We're all volunteers. And if anyone feels so inclined, we would love to have you as a member. I see Bob Haley is with us. He's a member. Thanks, Bob. So thank you once again for being here, and back to John.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. I sometimes what we do is go around the room and introduce ourselves, but given the number of people, that are here, although we're still trending lower than the registration list, I think we'll save the effort on that and save the time for our panelists today. And so today's program,
because I want to catch up, but
yeah, perhaps maybe I should make one housekeeping announcement before before I begin. And please try to keep your mics muted during the presentation, during the meeting, unless you're called upon. We would appreciate that. The program today, we put the title on it: Chips Communities United, Giving a Voice to U.S. Chip fab communities. And we have organized 5 speakers today who will offer up what I have called lessons from the Valley, with perhaps a combined experience of 150 to 200 years working on issues relating to the semiconductor industry's worker and community health and safety. Today's speakers have volunteered to share with us their experience and knowledge, their concerns and hopes as Central New York prepares for the semiconductor industry's expansion in Onondaga County. Ted Smith of San Jose, California, is the coordinator for International Campaign for Responsible Technology, as well as the founder of the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition. With fellow panelist Mandy Hawes, he co-authored the book Challenging the Chip: Labor Rights and Environmental Justice in Global Electronics Industry. This was in 2006, and a review in the Journal of Contemporary Sociology said that Challenging the Chip is a valuable resource document, a must-read for anyone wanting to understand the substance of environmental change-making in the 21st century. I would like to point out that another member on our call today, Professor David Sonnefeld of SUNY ESF, was a contributor and editor of that text as well. Mandy Hawes of Santa Clara, California, is a lawyer, activist, and the founder of the Safe Jobs, Healthy Families Initiative. In 1977, she founded the Santa Clara Center for Occupational Safety and Health. And in the 50 or so years since she has been bringing to light the dangers surrounding the electronics industry. Mandy's work has primarily focused on educational training and providing legal counsel for those impacted by exposure to neurotoxins in this area, in that area. She is a Harvard Law School graduate. Our third panelist is Lenny Siegel of Mountain View, California, and he is Executive Director of the Center for Public Environmental Oversight, and he's held that role since 1994. He is one of the American environmental movement's leading experts on both vapor intrusion and pathway and military facility contamination. And he has visited and provided technical assistance to scores of community organizations across the US. His organization produces two internet news groups, the Military Environmental Forum and the Brownfields Internet Forum, as well as facilitates TCE and PFAS discussion groups. He has served on several interstate technology and regulatory council work teams on environmental remediation, including vapor intrusion mitigation, and a dozen National Research Council committees addressing military environmental issues. In 2011, Lenny Siegel was awarded US EPA Superfund Citizen of the Year. In 2018, he served as mayor of Mountain View, California. Rand Wilson of Somerville, Massachusetts, is a labor organizer for various unions and has written and lectured widely about contract campaigns, strikes, healthcare reform, and strategies to build workers' political power. You can find his writings in Jacobin and The Nation. He is, and I imagine amongst other places, he is president of the Center for Labor Education and Research and serves on the board of directors of the ICA Group, the Local Enterprise Assistance Fund, and the Center for the Study of Public Policy, which support workers, worker-owned companies, and promote awareness of environmental issues. And last but not least is Judith Barish of Berkeley, California, and she is the outgoing advocacy director at Good Jobs First, where she has been the staff lead to CHIPS Communities United. Previously, she was founder and principal of a consulting firm that provided research, writing, strategy, and development support to progressive nonprofit organizations. She began her career as director of the California Fair Trade Campaign, a coalition of environmental, labor, and community-based organization advocating fair trade in the 1990s. For 2 years, she was communication director of the California Labor Federation, the AFL-CIO affiliate. She holds a Master of Public Administration from Harvard University and a Master of Politics from Princeton University. And Judith will be serving as the panel moderator today. But before I turn it over to her, let me remind you, keep your mics muted unless you are called on. We have planned for each panelist to speak approximately 5 to 10 minutes each, and we'll take your questions at the conclusion of all speakers. Please put questions in the chat. Or when the time comes, raise your virtual hand, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Judith, take it away.
Thank you so much, John. It's great to be here. Great to see so many of you who I have already been working with on the challenge of the semiconductor industry. And also I get to introduce and moderate this amazing panel of folks. I am very much the junior partner here. So what I was going to do was just give a little bit of an introduction to the CHIPS Act and to our coalition. So I'm going to share my screen with you. So CHIPS Communities United. This is the name of our new coalition that we're just forming, and I'm happy to be able to share it with you, introduce you to some of the leaders on it. So Our work begins with the CHIPS and Science Act, which passed a little over a year ago in August of 2022. This piece of federal legislation embodied the return of industrial policy to the United States after a generation of neoliberalism in which the government, at least ostensibly, refrained from the work of shaping markets to serve the public good. The Biden administration has, passed a number of bills. Most importantly, the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act that do just that. The goal of the CHIPS and Science Act is to make the US more competitive. So it's all about China, to improve supply chain resilience. Many of you remember when certain consumer goods were unavailable during the pandemic, and some of that had to do with the supply chain of semiconductors. And to bring good manufacturing jobs back to the United States after decades of deindustrialization. The CHIPS and Science Act is a $280 billion bill. It includes $52 billion for domestic semiconductor manufacturing. And actually, our math is that it's more like $100 billion when you add in the tax credits. But it's about $52 billion that'll be handed out to semiconductor firms. So far, the CHIPS office, the Commerce Department office that's handling the CHIPS incentive grant, has received over 480 applications. So this is already a massive endeavor. It's also spurred private investment, and which at last count was $231 billion that was committed across the country. Let me see. Yeah, so here's a list of some of the top investments that have been publicly announced. This is by no means an exhaustive list. I've got a list of, several, over 100 on my computer, but these are some of the big ones, each of them well over $1 billion in private investment. So what we're seeing is going to amount to tens of thousands, conceivably hundreds of thousands of jobs, and a transformation of a number of communities. Unfortunately, although I and our coalition are in support of many of the overall goals of the CHIPS Act, the semiconductor industry has a poor track record as a neighbor and employer. And the other panelists today will be able to share some details with you about that. I will just say that, one of the challenges is that wages, although there are promises that wages will be incredibly high, that these will be good jobs, we know that many of the jobs in the semiconductor industry are actually not high-paying jobs. When they give you averages of over $100,000 per job, that's averaging executive compensation and has very little to do with what production workers will be earning. We know that there's exclusion and discrimination in the workforce. It's a very white and male industry. And actually, the evidence is that it's become less representative since the 1990s, not more. It's an industry that is explicitly anti-union, and we don't see any evidence that that's changing. And there's no commitment in the CHIPS Act to create unionized production jobs. It's known for toxic workplace chemicals, and Mandy and Ted and Lenny will all be talking about that, and leaving environmental damage in communities. So in response to this, and wondering how we could make sure that this generation's investment in semiconductors didn't create the same problems as that of the past, we formed CHIPS Communities United. And here are the groups who are on the steering committee: unions, Communication Workers of America, the United Auto Workers, environmental groups like the Sierra Club, toxics experts like Ted's group, the International Campaign for Responsible Technology, Good Jobs First, the research organization that I work for, national community organizers, Jobs with Justice, and Jobs to Move America. So this is a dream team of high-powered organizations, and another 45 or so organizations signed on to a letter that we wrote to the semiconductor industry about a month ago, calling on them to partner with us and make sure that implementation of the CHIPS Act benefited communities, not just corporate executives. So the mission of CHIPS Communities United is to support local communities who are facing these massive investments, huge construction projects, and don't know what they're in for. We're advocating safe, equitable implementation of the CHIPS Act, both at the federal level and at the community level. We're helping to connect communities across the country facing similar challenges. So I love it that we've got we've got Jenna from Ohio and Dennis from New Mexico on here. I mean, that's exactly what we're going to be doing as our work rolls out, is connecting people in different communities who are facing the similar problems. And we're gathering resources, beginning with the network of national experts, some of whom are on this call today. Our vision is that semiconductor factories that are subsidized by our taxpayer dollars should be models of high road economic development. They should create good union jobs in production as well as construction. They should have state-of-the-art environmental safeguards for communities, rigorous occupational health and safety standards and enforcement, and protection of the local tax base so that we're not giving away all of our funds to bring these corporations into our communities. So that's what we're doing. That's who we are. There's information here about how to stay in touch with us. I will also put it into the chat so you can reach out. In my introduction, John mentioned that I'm the outgoing advocacy director at Good Jobs First, but I will continue to be working with CHIPS Communities United. So you will be able to reach me. And I have met many of you and look forward to meeting many more as the time goes on. That's it for me. I'm going to pass this on to Mandy, who's going to talk about some of the early days of the semiconductor industry in Silicon Valley. And I'm also going to warn folks that I have been tasked with keeping people to relatively brief presentations. So when you get close to 10 minutes, I might interrupt you to let you know. So apologies in advance for being rude, but we just want to have time to hear from everybody and hear your questions. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Mandy.
So good morning. It's a pleasure. I always operate on the basis of it's better to prevent than lament. And in this situation, sometimes you can't turn things around. So the more we can do to be prepared and create a safe possible work environment, the better. Early on, Skosh actually had a federal grant, thanks to Eula Bingham, to try to provide information for electronics workers here in Silicon Valley. We used to be the Valley of Heart's Delight, and we were a fruit processing industry, just a community. And so the workforce was, that workforce was spotted by the industry as ideal for what they needed. Hardworking immigrant women who were going to get their work done, not ask questions, not push back. No training, no warnings, no protection. Clean doesn't mean safe. It has to do with protecting the product, not the workers. People learned the hard way that the materials they were using were very dangerous. Skosh tried everything we could with a confidential multilingual hotline and other means of educating people who had questions or concerns. They didn't have representation, so standing up was risky. The chemicals that were in use include notorious ones like trichloroethylene, formaldehyde, a lot of carcinogenic materials, and also a lot of compounds that are toxic to the developing brain, which is a big deal when the workforce is predominantly women of childbearing age. We ran many campaigns. We tried to get TCE banned. We didn't get it banned. We got the best workplace standard in the world, but compared to environmental standards, it was a tiny fraction. That's an important point for people to understand. When people tell you everything's within legal limits at your job in the electronics industry, you'd be very scared because it has nothing to do with providing a safe environment. What we did continuously was try to raise issues and get engagement by the industry, or at least by the regulators. And probably our most memorable campaign was what we called Campaign to End the Miscarriage of Justice. And it was a demand that the industry study the rates of miscarriage in their workforce, because the chemicals in use had terrible histories, and they just want a job. If they are hazardous to healthy reproduction, that comes with them. And finally, the industry said, fine, we're going to do the study, that'll shut you up. Well, they did 2 studies, SIA and IBM did comparable studies, and they both found the same thing. They found high rates of miscarriage in the women working in the quote clean rooms compared to in the offices. But when the air sampling results came in, they were so much lower than the legal limits. They tried to say it's a coincidence, and we said, actually, take a deep breath. This is the best proof we've seen yet that these standards protect nobody. And if you can't make that change, this problem isn't going to go away. Unfortunately, they took their business model to other parts of the world, the same approach, same denial that these workplace standards are useless. Finally, federal OSHA has made that point clear, and we now know federal OSHA standards don't protect anybody, but that's kind of late for the people we're concerned about. When we've documented the harm, one of the things I try to focus on is an important lesson that the industry didn't want to get into when the miscarriage study results came out. They had to tell their workers about that. But I learned from people who called me, they said, I had a different question. I wanted to know if my coworker's child's problems could be related to her working here. And they got me out of there like that. Well, guess what? Any chemicals that are toxic, sufficiently toxic to cause miscarriage, a total fetal loss, actually can cause something that is much worse. And that is a child who survives, but with damage that's irreparable, with the worst damage being to a developing brain. There's no transplant, there's no do-over. And part of the work I do in Safe Jobs to try to make people aware of that so we can collectively, for all the best reasons, prevent any more of this. Because if the brain doesn't work, the burden is now on the public to provide the care this family, this child's going to need for life. And we provide it, but why is this something that the industry feels is like, this isn't our problem? I go, you caused it. And there's no excuse, there's no reason. So those are some of the campaign issues that we're pushing now. Federal agencies can be very helpful. NIOSH in the past has stepped up. There have been a number of publications. If people are interested, we'd be happy to share them. A lot of them are on the ICRT website. But those are the points I wanted to make, because we've been through this, and any community that thinks they got lucky when their name came up, please think again, and let's work together, because together we have at least an opportunity to get to what we're trying to accomplish, which is safe jobs, union jobs, and nothing left on the table. Thank you.
Thanks, Mandy. Next up is Ted Smith from International Campaign for Responsive Technology.
Thanks. And again, I'm really glad to be here and to see all of you. I wanted to just give some additional background of what we went through and what we discovered and what we tried to do about it going back over the years. Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition was formed initially as a kind of a spin-off of SCOSH. It was founded in 1982 following the discovery of groundwater pollution. Virtually every name brand company in the Valley, including HP, Intel, AMD, and IBM, all had leaking underground storage tanks. And they put their waste solvents in these tanks. They all leaked. They all got into our groundwater. And it led to a discovery that there was a cluster of birth defects in a neighborhood right across the street from the Fairchild semiconductor plant. And that led to an enormous amount of attention. And it led us to organize a broad coalition to try to help develop a local ordinance, which was being promoted by the firefighters at the time, to try to prevent this kind of thing from ever happening again. We were able to get a broad community right to know section into the ordinance for the first time of any place in the country. And that was over the objections of the industry, who was claiming that that was all trade secret information. You may have heard those kinds of claims yourselves. And it also, the ordinance also provides strict storage and monitoring requirements, because everybody was agreed that this should never happen again. And it was not only a scandal, it was a very expensive scandal. The industry over the time has spent over hundreds of millions of dollars trying to clean up the mess. Once you pollute the groundwater basin, it's enormously difficult to fix. We then took that legislation model and took it to California legislature, passed a similar law, and then eventually to the Congress. which in the reauthorization of Superfund developed the toxics release inventory, which now makes chemical usage of at least a certain kinds of chemicals available publicly. So that's a very helpful tool also. We also organized a campaign to get EPA to designate all these groundwater pollution sites as Superfund sites. And EPA, to our surprise, listed 23 of the sites, more than any other county in the country. So we have the unfortunate designation of having more Superfund sites than any place else. We then moved on to develop another ordinance, which is called the Toxic Gas Ordinance. The first one was mostly designed to focus on solvents, but the toxic gases are even more hazardous, and they have heavy resistance in the chip industry. Gases such as arsine and phosphine, diborane, etc. A very small amount of those will kill you on the spot, and if there's ever a major release, it could kill a whole lot of people in the community. So they do take these very seriously because they know they're extremely dangerous. Our ordinance requires double containment and monitoring and disclosure, and that you might check and see what the rules are going to be in Syracuse, because that ordinance has not spread very well around the country, and I don't know whether there's going to be anything like that in place there or not. As the industry started moving out of Silicon Valley, we started reaching out to other groups in other parts of the country. And one of the things we did was to organize a thing called the Electronics Industry Good Neighbor Campaign, where we linked up with the Southwest Network for Economic and Environmental Justice, and 4 of their member groups, including the Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque, Tonatiuh in Phoenix, and Poder in Austin, Texas, working with Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition. We pulled together a lot of information, and particularly we focused on water pollution and water excess. And as you know, these industries are extremely thirsty. And as we know, they also pollute a lot. And so we documented that in a book we called Sacred Water, and that's all available now too. And it has pretty good community-based research in each of those 4 communities. And then as the industry expanded globally, we also then reached out to other groups in other parts of the world. And at SVTC's 20th anniversary in 2002, we organized a global conference where we invited 50 delegates from 15 different countries. And they all came together and exchanged information, and were amazed to find out that they all had fairly similar experiences to what we were reporting. It was just starting in some of those places, but they were already seeing some of those kinds of signs. And then we decided to put all those stories together into the book that was mentioned earlier. It's called Challenging the Chip, Labor Rights and Environmental Justice in the Global Electronics Industry. So that's all now available with all those stories from around the world. You're going to hear in a little bit from Rand about the Semitech campaign, which is really the theoretical model of what we're trying to do here now with the CHIPS campaign, because there was another effort in the 1990s by the federal government to subsidize the chip industry, and we're actually able to get them to provide funding for some of the things we cared about. We also worked with some of these groups in other countries, particularly in Taiwan. We worked with a group that was dealing with the RCA plant, which had tremendous amount of groundwater contamination, and also had a lot of poison workers, so very similar to us. And also in Korea, there was a big Samsung campaign, where a number of young women working in the Samsung chip plant died of leukemia, and that was again a very big scandal. And after years of struggle, they finally got Samsung to apologize and to put up some funds to try to not only compensate the families, but to provide for safer technology. And as you'll note, Samsung and TSMC from Taiwan are part of this CHIPS Act. So we have Samsung, TSMC, and Intel, all with pretty strong history of what we're familiar with. What we don't have history with is Micron. So that's something that I have no reason to believe that they are any different than all the rest of them, but I think it's something that we really need to find out more about. And then in 2015, we convened an international conference again with delegates from around the world, and we developed what we call the chemical challenge to the global electronics industry, and with a whole set of principles and proposals that we wanted them to deal with. And that led to the development of a thing called the Clean Electronics Production Network, or CEPN. That's a multi-stakeholder network with Apple, HP, Dell, Intel, Seagate, and many other companies. And they have all adopted a goal to achieve zero exposure to hazardous chemicals in the global supply chain. So that's a really big, audacious goal. I have to say, we have that as a goal. We're a long way from getting there, but we do have at least agreement on what we have to do. And we're starting with trying to phase out and substitute in the worst of the solvents. And we're making some progress on that. We've also developed an occupational safety and health committee guide with equal participation of the workers. And so we're pretty happy with that too. And that's something that you might want to keep in mind as we move forward on all this also. And then as we began to see the emergence of this CHIPS Act, we actually tried to get some language into the bill. Our local congressional rep is Zoe Lofgren, who we've known for many years. She is also the ranking member on the House Science Committee, which is the committee of jurisdiction for the Department of Commerce. And since the money for this program runs to the Department of Commerce, she's in a pretty good position to help on these things. And she really has been a very good advocate. She has gotten us introduced to some of the people at the CHIPS department. We've had a very good call with about 20 of us and several of them, and where we've been able to present our whole program. And many of the people part of the CCU and some of the people on this call were part of that call also. And so we're looking forward to that kind of an engagement, and we're hoping that they're going to be able to support some of the things that we're talking about here. And I just wanted to close with a kind of a vision that I think drives a lot of our work. We call it the Sisterberg Principles, and it goes back to 1995 when I was involved in a group of US activists who got together with some European activists. And we developed what we call the Moore's Law for Sustainability. And as you know, Moore's Law is the driving force of this whole industry. Gordon Moore, one of the founders, said many years ago that each new generation of chip technology was going to be twice as fast, twice as small, and twice as cheap as the previous generation. And that's been true now for decades. And it's really the driving force. This thing changes so fast that it's very hard for all the rest of us to keep up with it. But what we decided was that we need to have a commitment that new technical innovations should also include improvements in the environment, health, and social justice issues. And it's an electronic sustainability commitment that those technical improvements should correspond to the rest of the kinds of concerns that we have, so that when their next generation doubles the size of or actually shrinks by half the size of the chip transistors, that we should make double our goals in terms of achieving more sustainability. So it's a pie in the sky kind of a goal, but it is what drives us. And I think that to understand that it's the Moore's Law that really is the driving force, which is such an enormous challenge for us. And I'll stop there and turn it back over to Judith.
Thank you so much, Ted. I know that people are going to benefit from being able to get a recording of this, because the information that you and Mandy have shared is so valuable. Yeah, really appreciate it.
It's really fast. So I hope you weren't trying to take notes.
It was really good. Actually, I want a copy of your notes, so we'll talk about that later. Next up is Lenny Siegel, who's another expert who's been in this as a researcher and a political leader and a community leader, has been in this fight for decades. Lenny.
Can I share my screen?
Yes, you can.
I'm going to try to do. It's not doing that well. Let's see. Might not be able to do it. Give me 1 second here.
We're all waiting with bated breath, Lenny.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, it's not going to let me do it. Can you see it?
No. So did you click on share screen and then you should be able to click?
The problem is new software, I think. Oh Oh, well, it's just mostly photo. So I was opening up with the a photo of a statue of the silicon atom in Mountain View, which when I was mayor in 2018, I spoke at the dedication of this call a statue, the sculpture. And Mountain View is the birthplace of the semiconductor industry. And when I spoke at this meeting, and the link is on my website, I basically talked about the role of communities and local government in protecting the environment and the quality of life and the economy around the semiconductor industry, and how that role is good not just for the community, but for the semiconductor industry itself. That if you really want to have a successful tech industry in your community, the most important thing is to create a community where people from all over the world want to live. The semiconductor industry, well, Ted mentioned how the Superfund sites we have, 4 of them are around the what's called the MEW Superfund plume here in Mountain View. It's a TCE plume about 1.5 miles long and 1/2 mile wide, and it includes Fairchild, Intel, Raytheon as some of the early semiconductor manufacturers, and also the former Moffett Naval Air Station. And I'm still working on the cleanup of that plume. There's a concern that the trichloroethylene that was left in the groundwater is migrating upwards into buildings, both residential and commercial. So the wafer fabs are gone. Google's here, but we still have systems trying to clean the groundwater, and that's going to be going on for decades, perhaps even centuries. It's really hard to clean up the TCE. But a recent study of PFAS at Moffett Field by NASA Ames, which took over the Naval Air Station, and PFAS are the so-called forever chemicals, found that the semiconductor industry may have released PFAS as well. And we didn't actually know much about the semiconductor industry using, these are perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl compounds. We didn't really know that they were using it, but as we looked into it, the industry says that PFAS compounds are essential to their operations. Now, most people know about PFAS either from manufacturing plants such as in Hoosick Falls, New York, or Parkersburg, West Virginia, where Dark Waters the movie was made about, and military bases like Stewart Air National Guard Base along the Hudson River. But the semiconductor industry uses a wide variety of PFAS chemicals for a wide variety of applications. They've introduced them over the years without considering their impact, their toxic impact on workers or the environment. So what I'm looking into these days is not only how do we do the research to eliminate PFAS from semiconductor production, which is going to take a long time because they built it in, but also how to manage its release, particularly into wastewater, because there are studies. There's a study from Cornell University showing that the chemicals, they aren't removing the chemicals from the wafer fabs because they don't have to, because these chemicals are not regulated. One of the challenges of PFAS is that even though there are a handful of targeted chemicals like PFOS and PFOA, which are known to be contaminants in firefighting foams, those are the contaminants at military bases, a lot of these chemicals aren't even measured. So sort of environmental activist experts are saying, what we really need to do is address total organic fluorine in the waste stream and not just the specific targeted chemicals. And indeed, the Cornell study shows that non-targeted chemicals, ones that we don't know what they are, actually exceed the quantity or the concentration of the PFAS chemicals that we know about. And so this is going to be a major challenge for wastewater treatment plants because they're responsible for imposing conditions through wastewater discharge permits on the releases from the plants. This information is also important because if there's a leak into the groundwater or the surface water, like storm drains, then it would be the same chemicals. And yet we don't know what they are, and the industry will not tell us what they are. And so one of the biggest demands that communities have to make is for transparency. Now, fortunately, PFAS is the flavor of the week for environmental regulators. EPA, New York DEC, regulators all over the country are very much aware of PFAS. So there is an opportunity to impose conditions. And one of the positive things about the new plants that are being built is they can build pre-treatment of the wastewater into their plants. They don't have to retrofit. They don't have to tear out walls or anything like that. They can design their plants to minimize the release of PFAS chemicals into the environment. So even though, as Ted said, there are many other toxic chemicals, acids and lethal gases that are used by the industry, PFAS is an opportunity because everybody's paying attention to it these days. The other thing that I work on, and this is what got me elected to the Mountain View City Council, is that this industry has what we call an hourglass workforce. That is, there are a lot of people who are paid well, and you hear about, someone talked about the median salary. A lot of people are paid well, and a lot of people who aren't, and not many opportunities for people to climb from the bottom to the top. And what that means is when a tech plant is built, that people are attracted from all over the world to be engineers and other professionals to work at those plants. And I don't have a problem with that, except for the fact that the communities that bring those people in don't plan for the housing that's needed for them to move in. So the people at the bottom of the spectrum, the economic spectrum, can't afford the housing. They're forced to commute great distances, creating greenhouse gas emissions. And here in Mountain View, and we no longer have wafer fabs. We have Google and similar companies. We have billionaires live here. A lot of very well-paid people making $300,000 a year, and people with jobs living on the streets. So you have to look at the urban planning impacts of bringing in these industries because of this hourglass workforce and the failure to provide adequate housing. Now, you don't want to put housing right next to a fab because it's so toxic, but there still is a need to plan for a way for people who are going to work in the industry to be able to get to work in a convenient way. Now, of course, the other solution to this intense inequality of income and wealth is to pay people better. And I think Rand's going to talk something about that. We're finding a lot of industries right now, people are able to organize and bring up their wages. That's absolutely essential for the semiconductor industry, because this industry goes all over the world looking for the cheapest place to do production, and they do that to hold wages down. So the jobs housing imbalance that we're dealing with in Mountain View is related to the fact that people who work in tech industry who are not professionals are paid very poorly. So I guess it's time to move it on to Rand. Since I don't have my slides, my website is www.cpeo.org, and there's a tab for chips. And a lot of the articles and memos I've written about this currently and 50 years ago are on that site. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lenny. And I think you've already queued up Rand, who's going to talk about some of the labor challenges. Rand Wilson, take it away.
Yeah, I'm a little under the weather. My voice is a little hoarse, but I'll do the best I can. Again, I want to thank everybody for this opportunity to talk about CHIPS Communities United and to talk about the opportunity that we have in Syracuse and in a dozen other communities across the country to win high road, good jobs, and a different model of economic development than what Lenny just described. I love the hourglass metaphor. We're particularly fortunate in that, just excuse me 1 second. We're particularly fortunate that, the CHIPS Act doesn't specify that these are going to be union jobs. We have, an intent by the Biden administration and the Commerce Department that these should be good jobs. And they've actually got a pretty decent kind of framework for what defines a good job. And so we have allies on all of that. And we've put together a coalition that Judith described, CHIPS Communities United. But that is not where the power is going to be. We're not going to find power in a national coalition unless it's fueled, informed, and linked to grassroots groups on the ground in the vicinity of these investments, whether it's in Clay, New York, or New Albany, or Phoenix, or near Austin, Texas, Taylor, Texas, or near Dallas, Fort Worth, Sheridan, or Boise, Idaho. Wherever these investments are, we need to be forming coalitions. And by linking those coalitions together, sharing information about how Micron is dealing with its investment and its relationship to the greater Syracuse and upstate New York area. If we share that information with other communities, then they will be able to say to Intel or Texas Instruments or Global Foundries or who am I leaving out? TSMC, to say to those companies, hey, Micron's doing this, they're giving us this opportunity. Why aren't you doing that with us? And likewise, if you were talking to Micron and you were saying, well, what about these PFAS chemicals? And what kinds of concerns should we have about that? And how much are you going to be doing that? Suppose you hit a brick wall there. Well, maybe we could embarrass Micron a little bit by saying that another company someplace else has been forthcoming on our questions. So the opportunity to share information between these different host communities is the way that we're going to build power. So we have this opportunity to work together. And personally, I've been hired by CHIPS Communities United to begin the organizing. So I'm pretty excited about that and hoping that between now and the end of January that we'll have a chance to kind of get to know each other and begin to make some preliminary links between the different communities. And then my hope is that we will have a series of public meetings in each of the communities where these CHIPS Act investments are going to be made, and then possibly a national convening of representatives from all the communities in Washington, where we can speak with senior leaders of the Department of Commerce or the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or with members of Congress. So there's a lot of exciting work to be done. I looking forward to getting started with all of you. Right on. There we go. Got the fist up from Dennis.
Thank you, Rand. Thank you so much. We have these guys, as you guys can all tell, we have some amazing expertise here. I'm seeing a few questions in the chat, so let me try to go through that and relay them. People keep putting questions in the chat or use the electronic raise hand function, and then I will recognize you to ask your question or make comments. I mean, we're a relatively small group and we can talk about the challenges we're facing, and if people want to share their experiences, I don't think you just have to ask questions. So, but the first question that I see is, are there differences in the environmental profile of memory chips versus processing chips? And I think maybe Ted or Lenny might be able to answer that. Ted, you're on mute. Ted, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I was going to say I'll defer that to Lenny.
We don't know because they don't tell us what chemicals they're using. Chances are, for most aspects of production, because the semiconductor industry is, writes things about how they make stuff. Chances are that they're using pretty much the same chemicals.
Thank you. Another technical question: will the recording be available afterwards? Yes, it will. It'll be on the Greening USA page. People have some recommendations here. The book Boiling Frogs, which is about Intel's experience, I think, in New Mexico. Is that right? Yes. And folks have other questions, or do you want to share your concerns either about Micron in Onondaga County or elsewhere? I'd like to hear what people are thinking, what you're worried about.
Judith, there's another question in the chat from Carrie. Did you see that?
Yeah, do you want to take that, Ted?
It's a really good question. I don't think I have a very good answer to it. Let me just go look at the question again. So others will see it. Or Carrie, do you want to weigh in on this a little bit?
If you don't mind, I'm not an expert by any means, but I'll introduce myself. My name is Carrie Egerbrecht. I'm a school teacher. I'm lucky enough to have a half day, so I'm able to join this conference, which is wonderful. Let's see, I've been teaching for 23 years. I was involved in NIPERG when I was in high school and college and in being an advocate. I have a nonprofit for child abuse, so I'm very, very comfortable and very familiar with advocating for marginalized groups of people. I happen to be a resident that resides less than a mile from the Micron project and had a very short but very interesting campaign running for Claytown board, because I was a big believer in, once I learned about this project coming near my home, I researched it. I was able to connect with Ted because I reached out to him on the internet and just had been involving myself. This is a very, very complicated production process. There's so many aspects of politics and things. So the teacher and me kind of tried to break it down into simple layman terms, not only for myself, but for the constituents I was trying to represent. And I think, and I could be wrong, but I might be the only political candidate or person running for office that had anything to say counter to what Ryan McMahon was bringing up. I did my research. I read the generic EIS. I mean, top to bottom highlighters. I had communications with Ted, and I was a big believer in the more I come educated on this topic, the quicker I'll be able to handle the politicians in front of me. So I had audience. It was a group hearing in front of what was once called White Pine Project, which is now Micron, and was able to speak in front of the board of OSIDA and Ryan McMahon himself. And I pretty much think he might have perceived I was a paid plant, because I came in and I'm like, and this and this and this, and what about, volatile organic compounds, and what about groundwater, and what about all of these things, because they are very savvy locally in Onondaga County at talking around things like most politicians were. And I'm 45, I've been around long enough. I remember some of these projects built on Superfund sites. Our mall in Central New York, Destiny USA, was built on an old place where they had lots of storages of oil bins. So they had a bunch of that. I was familiar with OSIDA coming in, making a project, and then not really coming to full fruition of what they promised. And since I and my children reside nearby, I said, well, you haven't really reached out in the community. You have a lot of your meetings and they end up being 2 days notice during work hours, when a lot of working parents or people who might be interested are unable to reach, to get access to the information. So my big point is, Ted and I have talked at length about this. At this point, I want to make sure I'm a unionist, I'm a public school teacher, so that we get the jobs to the right people, that we also are really mindful of producing something with the right EPA requirements. Like you said, I was taking notes myself, and some of this is even new to me, but that we do this in the right manner, because so many residential homes reside right near this production. And I take issue with it, not only because I'm there, but because it's the right thing to do. I said before, I'm like, I don't want to be Aaron Brockovich part two. We know better, we should do better. And so that holding their feet to the fire in the most appropriate way is what my big push is to do.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That's awesome.
I feel like I'm above my head in this, but also I'm like, well, wait a minute.
No, but
I'm a child of the 80s and 90s.
we need teamwork, right? We need to work together. Lenny, did you want to answer Carrie?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you're fortunate in Central New York that New York has SECRA, SEQRA, which is an environmental review law, somewhat like the National Environmental Policy Act. Now, unfortunately, people in both parties are trying to exempt the CHIPS Act projects from the National Environmental Policy Act, but they can't do that for SECRA. So you've already started the SECRA process in New York. They've done scoping. Many of you have taken part in that. SECRA does two things. One, it provides a public forum through which to raise these issues. And secondly, it basically will list all of the environmental permits and approvals that are necessary to make the plant move forward. Now, many of those are going to be, permits would be awarded, conditioned by the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. So that would be probably Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and the RCRA, which is for the treatment, storage, and disposal of hazardous waste. And so after in addition to the SECRA process, which provides the environmental review, there are actual permits. And those are something that there should be an opportunity for public comment on each of those things. Those are done by the state and not by local government. As well, the SECRA process is actually being carried out by Onondaga County. I hope I pronounced that right.
Yes.
However, one of the most important permits, was the wastewater discharge permit, through which Micron will be required to pre-treat industrial waste. That is actually issued by the publicly owned treatment work. I forget the name of the, but that is a more local thing. And that is usually treated as very technical, but there is an opportunity to influence that because the wastewater treatment plants are responsible for the air effluent. And if Micron releases contamination into the waste stream, which is mixed with all the human waste and other waste from the area, and they release it into the environment, they are responsible because they have to get a permit from the state of New York under the Clean Water Act for the National Pollution Discharge, it's called NPDES, National Pollution, well, NPDES, everybody calls it that. So there are all these opportunities. I suggest to each community where these projects are going on is to ask the local government to provide a list of permits that will be required and a timetable for when they will be open for public comment. And then if they don't provide it, create it yourself. Because there are many of these opportunities. There are some, you may find that there are some gaps. Ted's talked about some of the things that we were able to get in California that aren't necessarily available. So we have in California an accidental release program, which requires a risk management plan for the release of gases like arsine, phosphine, diborane, extremely hazardous substances. And as far as I know, other states, the other states with the CHIPS Act don't have that. So you may be in the position of asking for that or asking for something equivalent because those, I've talked a lot about PFAS, but these gases, if they're released into the neighborhood, they can kill people. They haven't killed people lately that I know of, and you don't know because it's not always measured, but here in Santa Clara County at the Apple semiconductor plant, it's a small one, a small R&D plant. There were 2 phosphine releases reported in the last few years.
Let me
I'm
follow
Oh,
up on
sorry.
that if I can, Judith. I think what we're realizing is that this is such an enormous kahuna that it literally takes not only a village, it takes many villages together working together. And the technical aspects of things, who does the permitting, what are the rules, what are the hazards, all that stuff is extremely important. But we also know that the local public officials are just bought into this thing completely because they see economic development. That's really, they think of this industry as the golden goose. So what you're experiencing here is exactly the same thing as people in Silicon Valley and New Mexico and every place else has experienced. And without an organized community, you could have all the technical knowledge you wanted and it wouldn't get you very far. But if you do organize in the community and get past the PR that Micron, I know, is already putting out, I've heard that from a number of people, and raise your own issues of real concern, that I think you have a pretty good chance. This is, I think I'm probably sorry to tell you that you are the best organized community so far in the country on all this stuff. And I say I'm sorry because you must feel you have such a long way to go. But nevertheless, you have a really good starting point, I think, and you're a lot further along than we were when we started out in 1982. So I would suggest that we really need to combine the technical know-how that Lenny has with the organizing know-how that Rand has, with the historical knowledge that Mandy and I both have, and together, I think with all of you, we can bring more people into this fight and look for strategic allies. We found the firefighters, and they were extremely important with us because everybody respects firefighters. I think one of the challenges you have in Syracuse and Clay is similar to what's happening in other parts of the country now. They're not building these plants inside the big cities. They're building them outside the big cities. So there's very little infrastructure out there. So you have to reach into areas. I mean, what does the fire department look like in Clay, Carrie? I imagine there's not even
It's volunteer, so it's very minimal. Yeah.
So that's the reality that we're faced with, and you're going to have to figure out your own strategy for how do you deal with the fact that they're out in these remote areas where you have lots of resources in the nearby cities, but how do you get those resources paying attention to and supporting the work that you're doing?
And one question that you could pose, Carrie, is how long does a person have to work at the OSHA limit to have been exposed to a lifetime dose of a chemical using the environmental standards?
I noticed that was one thing McMahon kept talking about. He's like, it's clean production, clean production. I said, no, sir,
no,
that's the chip you're protecting, not the worker.
So,
I said,
how long you have to be working at the OSHA standard to get 1 month.
Wow.
And dare them to go in and sit around for 2 months and say, hey, I'm fine. They don't want to have any of this. They don't want to be confronted by any of this, but we have to work to change that and close this gap, because there's no excuse for it. To take the CHIPS Act as the test case, it couldn't be better, because they certainly know that this is true.
Thank you so much. I know that now we have tons of questions, so I want to see if we can move through them expeditiously. Chris Carrick, you had a second question, but I'm going to hold that since we already answered one of your questions. I hear that Robert Haley has a question. Is that right?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Great panel. Thank you so much for your outside knowledge coming to our town. 2 questions, which I'll ask, and the whole panel can address them as they wish. One is, how can and this one really goes to Lenny, is it the case that we can't get these chemical names that you're looking for from the facilities that are getting state and public funding? That's one question. Why is it that exists, that we can't get the name of the chemicals? Granted, there's business. Sensitive information is probably the answer. But the second question, in architecture, I'm an architect, and we deal a lot in this forum with sustainability and lead for architecture in all buildings. Are there standards such as LEED for architects that are impacting these industrial facilities, and where might those successes be for us? Thank you.
So I'm unaware of any lead requirements specific to semiconductor production, but you may be able to focus on things like water and energy, nevertheless. I mean, this industry is pretty remarkable in the production that they do, and and the microscopic level at which they operate. So I doubt that there's anything that's really tailored to those aspects. But they, the secret process should provide the information on energy and water use and how they're going to import that. I think you know some of that stuff already.
Mhm.
In terms of the chemical use, Ted and I recently attended a meeting of the Semiconductor Environmental Safety and Health Association meeting here, actually at the Micron office in Santa Clara. I think it's Santa Clara. And the environmental professionals from the industry acknowledge that they can't solve these problems company by company. So they share information about the chemicals they're using, but then the companies turn around and hide the information under confidential business information because they need to compete.
Yeah.
And so you have to place for each permit, you have to fight to require disclosure. Now, maybe you can't require disclosure of exactly how much of what chemical they're using, but they should be able to provide a list of the chemicals that they're using because they're all buying supplies from the same suppliers.
Yeah.
And it's a phony claim of confidential business information, and they've always done it. And then there, if like the accidental release program that we have here with the risk management plan, there's certain chemicals they have to acknowledge. And so I would look into your state, ask your state legislature, is there any, if they don't have it, how do you get an accidental release program? How do you get risk management plans for the use of extremely hazardous substances? And my guess is that there are people in DEC who would be willing to work with you on that.
And workers have the right to know. Workers have the right to know and the right to refuse dangerous work. And until they produce the information, absolutely, nobody should be taking that, taking a bold promise without some documentation. They should have all that information available. None of it's a trade secret.
But they're claiming that these are trade secrets.
Test it.
Right.
I was at a meeting yesterday in Oakland, and one of the speakers was from Intel, and she is in charge of their chemical footprinting project. And she says that they have absolute information about every single component in their whole supply chain. They require that all their suppliers provide that kind of information to them, but they hold it very secretly. And she said even within Intel, it's held very closely. But what we've always said is that if there's a secret sauce that is your bread and butter for why your chip is better than Intel's or why it's better than somebody else's, okay, maybe there's a reason for not disclosing that secret sauce. It's 12% this and 13% that and 15% that. But there's no reason for you not to disclose what are the hazardous elements of that material. And so if you focus on the hazards and you can get the CAS numbers for those hazardous chemicals without asking for the formula of the mixes, that's a way sometimes that you can get past that. And the other thing is that as you're focusing on this stuff, if you have to, you could say to the regulators, if you have to, and there's no other way you can figure out how to do it, they can sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement with the industry so that they can at least get the information and to look at it. That's, I think, a last ditch effort to do it that way. I don't like that because that means that the community doesn't get access, but at least the regulators should be able to. And I know in Ohio, Intel is taking the position it's all confidential. That's just BS. And I think that we're gonna have to fight this fight all around the country again, as we did in the 1980s here. But I think we can win on a lot of those issues. So I think you just got to keep at it.
Thank you. I want to add one small thing before I go to some of the other questions we have, which is that CHIPS Communities United met with folks in the Commerce Department a few weeks ago, and the woman who runs the environmental strategy piece of the CHIPS Act implementation, who was a former lobbyist for the chemical industry, told us that she couldn't get the information on these chemicals either. So it was just a challenge, their trade secrets, and there was nothing they could do about it. So we're running up against this at the highest level. And as Rand says, we need to build enough power to make them listen to us. I have 3 people right now with questions, Greg Leroy, Don Hughes, and Dennis O'Mara. So maybe we'll get all 3 of your questions out quickly, and then the panelists can address them as they see fit. So Greg, do you want to ask your question?
No, I was just giving a thumbs up to something Lenny said.
Oh, okay. Apologies. Don Hughes.
Okay, let me unmute. So my big concern is about the perfluorinated compounds. I'm in Syracuse, and the industry is adamant. I have a whole bunch of publications that these things are and just an integral part of every aspect of their operations. So I'm resigned to the fact we're going to have these things. There's hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. And a lot of this has just been discussed about non-disclosure. We've got to get these things disclosed. And I'm wondering how do we go about doing that? And the corollary to that is, how do you regulate this on the end? So the wastewater and the groundwater, the air emissions, there are regulations put on as a, and I'm worried that it's going to be chemical by chemical, but we don't even know what the chemicals are.
Thanks,
So-
Don. Let's get Dennis's question. And
Okay.
then folks, you can answer both at once. Dennis.
So, Mayor, I'm co-chair of Clean Air for All Now. We're located just outside of Albuquerque. Our Intel plant sits at the nexus of Albuquerque, Rio Rancho, and my little village of Corrales. I didn't have questions. I had 2 comments, and maybe that second comment one of the experts could discuss further. Just to endorse what Ted said earlier about the importance of organizing. That's what we've been saying to a couple of other locales, that you got to have an organization to represent you with your with whatever company is working on a chip plant there, and also with your regulators. Without that, you're dead in the water. I just wanted to comment briefly about what I understand to be the way EPA categorizes abatement equipment. And there are 3 acronyms: RACT, BACT, and LACT. And RACT means reasonably available control technology. BACT is best available control technology. And LACT is lowest achievable control technology. In order from bottom to top in terms of effectiveness, shame on the EPA for naming their sort of mid-range average control technologies as best. BACT, or best available control technology, is not best. And but that's what I think a lot of these companies are trying to present to communities, to try to demonstrate that they're doing the very best possible to abate emissions. That's a lie. And so any organizations up against a new fab producer needs to confront that as a lie, and insist that they go with the absolute best, the best as we understand it in layman's terms, technology available in the market today. And that involves the use and implementation of what are called hybrid systems, where emissions are treated, then retreated, and maybe treated again before there's anything let out into the air. So let me turn to any of the experts and see if I've misstated anything, or if you want to add to it or whatever.
see. What was the previous question? Because I did have something on that.
PFAS.
So the Cornell study, which I reference in my memos, actually was able to measure PFAS in wastewater from semiconductor fabs. And so it is possible to learn about some of these chemicals. Since they don't break down easily, if you find them in the wastewater, you know that they've been using them. And they measured, I don't know, 40 target chemicals, which are known, and then the total organic fluorine as well. So you can find out some of that information by measuring the effluent from the plant. And so we aren't totally in the dark, but we don't know the concentrations. We don't know what the priorities are. We know that when the industry stopped using PFOA and PFOS, they started using PFBS, which is a shorter chain, and I believe that's one of the major chemicals they use. We know that they use polymers such as Teflon extensively in the industry. Those are not an immediate threat at the plant, but where they're manufactured and where they're disposed, they become an environmental threat. So we know something about what they're using. And, you know, you guys, you have to keep pressing to get a more complete list. As far as electricity and water, most of these companies are actually willing to try to do a better job. We've seen that with the software companies in Silicon Valley, where the way they recruit people, the best engineers from all over the world, is they tout how green they are. So Google, you know, uses solar power, and Intuit has birdhouses for the birds in the adjacent wetlands. And so identifying those issues and asking them, you may actually get a response where they're going to be trying to minimize energy use and water use. But if you don't raise the issues, they probably won't. So there is an opportunity there. They don't have to. Their industrial requirements don't mean that they have to waste a lot of electricity in their, you know, in their offices and stuff like that. So they'll do some stuff. But the PFAS use, they've introduced these things in such a way that you can't just, for most of the uses, you can't just put something else in there. And that's what they're arguing in their papers. There are some exceptions. People in Massachusetts came up with a chemical substitute, but there needs to be a lot more research, and they have to, what I think CHIPS Communities United is asking for is that we be a part of the program deciding what needs to be researched to reduce the use of toxic substances in the production of chips.
Let me just follow up on that notion about we want to be part of the process. I think whether you're talking about trying to direct resources toward new research that we want to see, but also in terms of some of the points of leverage that you have in the local community, and there's a number of them. Maybe working with the wastewater treatment facility to try to establish a formal engagement so that you have a right to be at the meetings, you have a right to get access to information. If you can establish that with them, that would put you a leg ahead. There's been a number of examples over the years of communities getting involved and actually having agreements, enforceable agreements for not only engagement, but what the rules of engagement are. And you're never going to get them to agree to outsource decision-making to you, but you can get agreements to have them have to take seriously your participation, and for you have to have the right to get the information and the feedback on it. So, and whether you're talking about wastewater or air emissions or even the water supply issues, there's a number of those kinds of leverages where it's possible for people to get involved with local agencies. And the local agencies are sometimes not as beholden to the companies as are the politicians, although they certainly know that don't want to get crosswise with the big companies, because it's the big companies that are going to be driving all this stuff and who really do have a lot of their own expertise. And the reality is that no local government has anywhere close to the kind of expertise that the companies have. So it's an unfair fight when you do it on a technical level at that point. But if you can, get yourself into the processes where they have to listen to you, and then we can use the resources from this network to actually support you on some of these issues, that gives you at least a little bit more standing for having some say-so in some of those decisions.
Great. I am loving this conversation. We are getting towards the end. We've got about 5 minutes left. We've got a couple of outstanding questions from Chris Carrick. And Chris, I don't know if you want to jump on and voice your top question, and then we'll hear from Peter, and then I'll turn it over to Rand to answer, and I think we'll close out then. Chris, the floor is yours. Maybe you've gone somewhere else. So Chris had 2 questions. One was about whether there are any positive examples of chip fabs using renewables. And the second is was about the power that local authorities, like the county and the town have to regulate. So anybody want to take those questions before we hear from Peter?
I think there has been some research done on what the company's commitments are to using renewables. I don't have it in my front of mind right now, but that's something we can look at. It might be that our allies with the Sierra Club might have some information on that. I know they're making some commitments. I think we have to be careful about when they say that they're making progress on climate, that they're not just doing emissions trading, because that's another area where the industry is frequently wanted to go, which doesn't really help the local community much at all. But I think there is some progress. I think it's not nearly where it needs to be.
Thank you. Peter, you want to ask your question and see if we can get it quickly, and then I want to make one comment before we wrap up. Peter, you're muted.
Okay. A quick comment and a question. I work with the climate change organization. We've been encouraging / having conversations with Micron in terms of reducing their fossil fuel usage as much as possible. 2 areas. One is that they heat the plant with electric heat pumps. The other is, and this might sound like sort of nickel and dime considering the amount of energy they use, but they're going to have a cafeteria for up to 9,000 employees. And there are commercially designed kitchens with induction technology, et cetera, that are all electric. I mean, there's no need to have any natural gas in Micron's cafeteria. But my question is, have there been any successful campaigns or attempts around the country to educate consumers that, we all want and use these products, these chips? I bought my first ever electric car in my life. I was told it's got a few thousand chips in it. So I create the demand and Micron creates the supply. So all consumers, I think, need to understand that these products all have an environmental cost to them. And so have there been any campaigns around the country to get consumers to understand that equation?
We spent a lot of time in the early years trying to do consumer education through getting stories into the media.
Is the silence no?
Oh. I was trying to respond.
I can hear you, Ted.
What?
Yeah,
I can hear you.
Okay.
Judith, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me, Peter?
Yeah.
Maybe Peter's turned off his speakers.
Yeah, he took his things out.
Ah,
All right.
Peter, put your
Let me
hand-
just
Go ahead, Ted.
respond quickly. I think the media has an enormous role here to play, and I think that one of the real challenges is how do we get our stories out through the media? So that's the way we get to consumers, and we can talk about how we all are reliant on this technology. But if people don't have the information about what those trade-offs are, and how the companies themselves can do better if we pay attention to them, I think we're we're fighting an even more uphill battle. I think we need to get a lot more attention from the media to these concerns. And I think that we were able to do that, and by working with media reporters in a number of different media outlets, so that they got to know what these real concerns were. And I think the more we're able to do that, the more we can get to the question you're raising, Peter.
In the language of economics, what needs to be done is to internalize the environmental costs. So if there is a cost to the environment caused by the production of a product, then that should be built into the cost of the product. And that way, better decisions are made.
Yeah. Rand, do you want to have the last word?
I'd love to have the last word. But before I have the last word, there is going to be $11 billion spent on R&D, and they've set up a new company called Semi-US, which will be a private nonprofit R&D institute, very similar to Semitech in the 1990s, to where these companies are going to be collaborating with one another on making smaller, faster chips. We need to be going to this $11 billion research institute, Semi-US. It just got created, and make sure that the concerns that have been articulated here and elsewhere are put on the table there and taken seriously. And again, I think we'll have allies in the federal government right now. Perhaps they'll help us do that. The last word, though, is all about power. These are a lot of concerns. We've got to get better organized. We've got to find other allies beyond this has been almost exclusively an environmental conversation, but there's a whole question here about skill acquisition and who's going to be trained, and how are people going to be recruited to go work in these facilities. 9,000 people in a cafeteria. That's, I mean, the potential impact that could be extremely positive in underserved and previously underrepresented communities. It's an enormous opportunity and potentially a great ally. Labor unions are supporting this communities, CHIPS Communities United. We want to make sure that these are good jobs. And then there are, I think in the chat, a lot of questions about, the infrastructure and how this is going to be taxing the community. So there are people with legitimate concerns about that. Got to bring people together. And if we do that, I think we'll have the juice to be taken seriously by Micron, and just as importantly, by the Department of Commerce that's making these investments. So I'm really looking forward to that work. And I think we're off to a great start. This is a really beautiful panel. A lot of good stuff came out. But to get past we've got some work to do to get organized. That's it. Thanks a lot, everybody. Really appreciate this opportunity to meet with people in Syracuse. And I'm so happy that folks from Ohio, from New Mexico, and I believe from someplace else, one other community, were able to get on. Look forward to many more Zooms.
Thank you so much, everybody. My email is in the chat, and John wants to close us out. So thank you so much for hosting us. Great discussion. You guys are a great community. This is not the last time we'll talk. We'll have more of these.
Great. Thanks, Judith. And thanks for all the attendees today. We really appreciate you being here. Thanks to our panelists. You really exceeded our expectations. And Judith, thanks for making my job easy today by agreeing to moderate the group. The recording will be available. All the attendees should get a copy of the link when that becomes available. I don't think I have anything else to say to all of you, but I'm grateful for the panelists for being with us today. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
John, this